The Caldwell family fortune was built on trust, but 24-year-old Priya Singh destroyed that trust the moment she shared a secret with a man who held the keys to her new life. On her wedding night, in a luxury Sydney suite overlooking the Opera House, the ceremonial knife brought to protect her from evil would be driven deep into the chest of both her husband and her lover. If you're fascinated by the dark reality of forced choices, the tragic clash of cultures, and how an act of betrayal can turn a dream wedding into a double murder, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more shocking true crime stories. But let's go back to where it all began. The Grand Ballroom of the Four Seasons Sydney had been transformed into a fusion of Australian extravagance and Indian splendor. Gold silk draped from the 20-foot ceilings, mingling with garlands of marigolds flown, especially from Mumbai. Tonight was the union of the Caldwell and Singh families, a merger not just of people, but of continents and fortunes. Ethan Caldwell, 29, heir to Australia's largest independent property development firm, stood beside his new wife, Priya Singh, 24. Ethan was the picture of clean-cut, Australian privilege, confident, tanned, and oblivious to the seismic instability beneath the surface of his perfect life. Priya, radiant in a heavy, deep crimson lehenga, her movements restricted by the intricate gold jewelry, looked every bit the demure, ideal bride her family had wanted. Yet, behind the practiced smiles and lowered gaze, a silent clock was ticking down the hours to an inevitable explosion. She had not consented to this marriage. She had been coerced by a quiet, relentless pressure that began 4 years earlier when she first arrived in New Zealand on a student visa. Her father, a respected academic in Chandigarh, had made it clear. The family's honor, her continued stay in the Antipodes, and her future career hinged entirely on securing the Caldwell name. For Priya, this wasn't love. It was an immigration strategy financed by familial debt, a desperate bid for a better life. She feared losing every minute. But the true architect of Priya's desperation was not her family, nor the man she had just married. It was Graham Caldwell, Ethan's 60-year-old father, the patriarch of the empire and a man whose ego was as vast and unforgiving as his property portfolio. Graham had observed Priya's precarious position, her visa anxiety, her deep-seated fear of disappointing her traditional family, and had weaponized it. The affair had begun 3 months before the wedding, a series of calculated meetings under the pretense of discussing cultural integration and family business. Graham offered protection, a bypass around the stifling Caldwell rules, and whispered promises that her visa status would be absolutely secure, whether the marriage lasted or not. He presented his interest as a rescue, a necessary evil to keep her afloat in the ruthlessly competitive Sydney environment. For Priya, it was a terrifying, power-laden transaction. The luxury hotel suite they used for their meetings, overlooking Bondi Beach, became her secret prison, where compliance was the currency for her future freedom. She hated him, his entitled touch, and his constant reminders of her vulnerability. But the alternative, deportation, disgrace, and a return to a life of limits, was a greater fear. The tension in the ballroom was palpable to only one person besides Priya, Graham himself. He stood on the podium, raising a glass of $1,000 champagne, his arm draped possessively around his wife, Eleanor, yet his eyes were locked onto Priya, a possessive, knowing glint that sent shivers of revulsion down her spine. He knew the secret that would obliterate his family, yet he carried the burden of his hypocrisy with arrogant ease. He was enjoying the spectacle he had orchestrated, the ultimate power play, giving his son a wife he already owned. As the reception drew to a close, a sense of suffocating dread descended upon Priya. The final ritual, the presentation of the wedding gifts, included a symbolic kirpan, a short, ornately jeweled ceremonial dagger, from her uncle, a former brigadier in the Indian Army. It was a traditional Sikh symbol of defense, a reminder that the bride was never without protection. Priya held the heavy, cool hilt, its silver polish to a lethal shine, and felt a dangerous flicker of agency in her hands for the first time in months. She was escorted, along with Ethan, to the bridal suite, a lavish space dedicated to the night that should have been the beginning of their life. Instead, it was to be the final arena where her secret would play out. As the door closed, locking her inside with a man she was sworn to, and a secret that belonged to his father. Priya knew the time for pretense was over. Her heart hammered against the silk of her wedding dress. The digital trail of her betrayal, the secret texts and intimate photos she thought she had deleted, was a volatile fuse. And somewhere, perhaps in his own private study, Graham Caldwell was watching the clock, waiting for the fallout from the game he had so recklessly started. The wedding bells had stopped ringing. Now, only silence and the dark, deep waters of the Sydney Harbor waited to bear witness to the end of the Caldwell dynasty. The Caldwell engagement announcement, made with characteristic Caldwell fanfare in the exclusive pages of the Sydney Morning Herald, was a carefully manufactured fantasy. It featured a smiling Priya, a radiant Ethan, and a sparkling diamond against the backdrop of the harbor bridge. What the glossy photo failed to capture was the quiet, constant terror in Priya's eyes, a terror that had intensified 3 months before the ceremony, when she realized the full extent of Graham Caldwell's control. Graham had always loomed large in her life, not just as the family patriarch, but as the gatekeeper of her entire future in Australia. He controlled the Caldwell Foundation, which had nominally sponsored her visa pathway, and he maintained deep, powerful connections within the federal government, connections that could fast-track her citizenship or, with a single, cold phone call, ensure her immediate deportation. The seduction was not romantic. It was a cruel, calculated game of power. Graham first approached Priya under the guise of mentorship, inviting her to private strategy meetings to discuss her career path, ensuring she understood the fragility of her current status. He never threatened her outright, but his language was laced with warnings. "You're an excellent fit for the family, Priya, but you must realize how many young women would kill for your position. Loyalty to the family, true loyalty, is everything to me." The transition from professional consultation to private, intimate demands was shockingly quick. It began with subtle touches, moving rapidly to late-night meetings at his private, unlisted hotel penthouse overlooking Bondi. For Priya, every meeting was a degradation, a compromise of her dignity for the sake of survival. She knew the moment she capitulated, she had crossed a line that could never be erased, but the fear of failure, of shaming her family and losing her chance at freedom, was overwhelming. The visa was her life raft. Graham was the man who held the rope. She tried to end it twice. The first time, after 2 weeks of secret meetings, she pleaded exhaustion from wedding planning. Graham simply sent her a text message containing a screenshot of her current student visa expiration date, magnified and circled in red. The message underneath was short. "We have a lot to talk about, Priya. Don't disappoint me." The second time, she attempted to confide in Ethan, hoping his progressive, modern outlook would offer a shield. Ethan, however, was deafened by his own privilege and the weight of his father's reputation. When Priya hinted at Graham's controlling nature, Ethan dismissed it with a patronizing chuckle. "Dad's just old school, darling. He's testing your commitment to the Caldwell name. It's a bit much, but that's how business is done." Ethan saw a test of character. Priya saw a noose tightening around her neck. Ethan's utter failure to see the danger solidified Priya's isolation. She was trapped in the center of the Caldwell web, and the only person who offered her an escape route was her tormentor. The digital footprints of the affair were numerous and volatile. Graham insisted on using an encrypted messaging service, believing himself invincible, but he was complacent. Priya, using her coding background, quietly maintained a mirror image of their correspondence. Dozens of explicit messages, secret photos of their rendezvous location, and Graham's veiled threats regarding her immigration status. She did this not out of malice, but as a terrified insurance policy, a hidden weapon to be deployed if the situation became entirely unbearable. She kept the phone hidden inside the lining of the Kirpan sheath, the ceremonial dagger gifted by her family, a silent testament to the deadly secrets concealed beneath the veneer of tradition. As the wedding day approached, the pressure became unbearable. Graham, fueled by his hubris, became increasingly reckless. He began sending her messages not on their encrypted channel, but on her personal phone, often mixing business with deeply personal, disturbing remarks. One night, a chilling message arrived. "I see your engagement party photos. You look lovely, but you look better when you're only looking at me." See you soon, daughter-in-law. This was the evidence she would eventually fail to delete. The final, casual act of carelessness that would shatter the Caldwell empire. Priya spent the entirety of the last week before the wedding existing in a state of controlled panic, deleting, redeleting, and then recovering evidence in a cycle of desperation. She was no longer just preparing for a wedding. She was preparing for war. She knew that the moment she walked down that aisle, she would officially become Graham's property in the eyes of the Caldwell family, and a victim in her own right. What she didn't realize was that the quiet phone, hidden in her bridal suite, would be the instrument that exposed everything and triggered the bloodshed. The wedding was set to begin in just 6 hours, but for Priya, the marriage was already a crime scene. The Sydney Bride, Part 3. The presidential bridal suite of the Four Seasons was a sanctuary of opulence, its silence broken only by the soft, rhythmic lapping of the Sydney Harbor water below. Rose petals, scattered by the hotel staff, formed a crimson path from the door to the massive king-sized bed, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a dazzling, private view of the opera house. Priya had shed the heavy, restrictive layers of her lehenga, changing into a delicate, simple silk nightgown, but the sense of being trapped only intensified. Ethan, buoyant with celebration and champagne, was oblivious, talking excitedly about their future, a perfect life in a perfect Sydney suburb. Priya stood by the window, clutching the ceremonial kirpan and its decorative sheath, the small, hidden phone inside feeling like a lead weight. She was contemplating confessing everything, the manipulation, the threats, the affair, a final, desperate move for honesty. But before she could find the words, Ethan's attention was snagged by the other phone, the one she had accidentally left on a small table while changing. It was her personal phone, and it was buzzing with a notification that had bypassed her temporary attempts to mute it. Ethan picked it up, expecting a message from his best man. His easy smile dissolved instantly as he read the screen. It was the last, most careless message from his father, sent hours earlier, the one Graham should have never sent to her personal device. Don't worry about the visa, darling. You've proven your loyalty where it matters most. See you at the foundation meeting tomorrow. But tonight, enjoy the boy toy. The silence in the room became a suffocating vacuum. Ethan's face, moments ago full of adoration, hardened into a mask of complete, visceral betrayal. What is this? His voice was a low, dangerous growl. He didn't need clarification. The words darling and loyalty, combined with his father's name, were enough. He started scrolling, his breath hitching, finding the other explicit, recent text that Priya hadn't managed to fully wipe from the device's main log. The perfect life was collapsing around him in a flurry of digital lies. It's not what you think, Ethan. Priya rushed towards him, desperation tearing at her voice. It was his fault. He blackmailed me with my visa. He controls everything. Ethan shoved her away with a sudden, unexpected violence that shocked them both. Blackmail? You think that justifies sleeping with my father, the man who built this family? You disgusting fraud. You came here for money and a passport, and you paid with your body, with my father. The words were screams of pure, wounded pride. The Caldwell honor, his masculine control, the entire manufactured perfection of his life, was destroyed. He grabbed the kirpan sheath, ready to smash the phone hidden inside, but in the process, the ceremonial dagger clattered onto the marble floor. It was at this moment, precisely 1:17 a.m., that the emergency knock came at the suite door. Graham Caldwell, likely having received a panicked, incoherent call from Ethan's cell moments before, stood in the doorway, his silk dressing gown hastily thrown over his tuxedo trousers. He looked calm, menacing, and entirely in control. Ethan, control yourself. This is a private matter. Priya, you had your chance. I'm taking care of this. He had come to finish his power play, to assert his dominance over his son and silence the girl. Graham stepped into the room, his eyes assessing the damage, the shattered illusion, the rage-filled son, the terrified bride. You will leave this room now, Priya. I've already arranged for your flight back to Delhi tomorrow. Your visa is invalid. You lose everything. This ends quietly. Priya saw her life flash before her. Deportation, disgrace, the complete annihilation of her family's name. She looked at Graham, the calm, entitled face of her tormentor, then at Ethan, his face contorted in a hate-filled rage that promised violence. She was trapped between the two Caldwell men who had ruined her. Her desperation exploded into a primal, self-preserving instinct. Her eyes fixed on the Kirpan lying near Ethan's foot. In a flash of terrifying speed, she lunged for it, scooping the silver hilt from the floor. Ethan, caught off guard by the sudden, desperate movement, stumbled back. The confrontation was no longer about money or visas. It was about survival. Ethan lunged for her, reaching for the blade, his movement driven by a blind need to silence the proof of his shame. Priya swung the heavy, ceremonial weapon not with skill, but with the frantic strength of pure terror. The polished steel, meant to protect her honor, sliced through the air and found its mark in Ethan's abdomen. The sound was sickening, muffled by the lush carpet. Ethan gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief, the blood blooming instantly on his pristine white shirt. He crumpled to the floor, his life draining out onto the expensive rug, a sudden, horrifying casualty of his father's sins. Graham stared at his son's body, his face slack with a shock that finally transcended his arrogance. You little bitch. You killed him, he roared, lunging forward, not in grief, but in explosive, possessive fury. Priya, now stained with her husband's blood and consumed by a terrifying, cold calm, didn't hesitate. As Graham reached her, she raised the dagger, the blade reflecting the harsh light of the emergency exit sign. She plunged the Kirpan deep, delivering a final, brutal blow to the chest of the man who had thought himself above consequence. Graham didn't even have time to scream. He collapsed beside his son, the two men, father and son, betrayer and betrayed, now united in a pool of their own blood. Priya stood above them, the jeweled Kirpan heavy and wet in her hand. The opulent bridal suite was silent once more, but now the silence was absolute, suffocating. She looked down at the two bodies, then at the blood-splattered silk nightgown, her face empty of all emotion. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, terrifying stillness. She dropped the weapon, the clatter on the marble a final, echoing punctuation mark. She walked slowly to the rose-petal-strewn bed, pulled a blanket over her shaking legs, and sat down to wait, the digital proof of the entire tragedy still waiting on the phone on the nearby table. The dream of a new life had ended in a double murder, and the Sydney bride was now just a bloody, silent statue in a luxury tomb. The quiet of the presidential suite was finally shattered at 6:15 a.m. by the horrified shriek of the hotel housekeeper, followed seconds later by the blaring arrival of emergency sirens that reflected crimson and blue across the glass facade of the Four Seasons. The wedding celebration was officially over, replaced by a crime scene that would instantly captivate Australia and India, not just for the high-profile victims, but for the shocking nature of the suspected killer, the seemingly docile bride. Detective Inspector Sophia Reyes arrived on the scene within the hour, a veteran of Sydney's Organized Crime Task Force whose usual beat involved complex financial fraud, not bloodied wedding nights. Her first glance at the room, the scattered rose petals, the overturned champagne bucket, the two bodies of the wealthy Caldwell men, and the silent, crimson-stained figure of Priya, told her this was no simple crime of passion. It was a complex narrative of power, desperation, and destruction. Priya sat motionless on the bed, draped in a silk blanket that did little to hide the blood that had dried on her neck and arms. The ceremonial Kirpan lay a few feet away, its silver hilt smeared, its polished blade a grotesque piece of forensic evidence. Her stillness was unsettling. There were no tears, no hysterical screams, only a profound, exhausted vacancy in her eyes. When questioned, her initial response was a single, chilling whisper: "They took everything." The initial narrative constructed by the hotel staff and the first officers on the scene was simple, if horrific. A young bride, overwhelmed by the pressure and possibly drunk, snapped and murdered her husband and father-in-law. This was compounded by the fact that the two Caldwell men, despite their wounds, were clothed, suggesting the violence happened after the initial intimacy, potentially during a heated argument. The victims were high society pillars. The perpetrator was a young, foreign woman dependent on a visa. The public narrative wrote itself immediately. The Black Widow Bride. However, Detective Reyes was trained to look past the surface. While her team photographed and collected the obvious evidence, the weapon, the two bodies, Reyes was drawn to the digital landscape of the suite. The murder was brutal, but the atmosphere felt orchestrated, almost like a final act of a long-running play. She noticed the two mobile phones on the side table. One was Ethan's, face up. The other was Priya's personal device, its screen still illuminated by a chilling, half-read text message that Reyes immediately photographed before allowing the technicians to bag it. Reyes then noticed a subtle anomaly, a small, almost imperceptible tear in the lining of the Kirpan's ornate sheath. When the forensic team delicately examined the sheath, they discovered the second, smaller mobile phone hidden inside the internal lining. This was Priya's encrypted insurance policy phone, a device she had been too shocked to remember to hide or destroy. That discovery changed everything. Reyes knew that a crime committed by a hysterical, overwhelmed bride would involve a single phone call to the police or a confused defense. But a bride who meticulously maintained two separate, highly sensitive devices, one containing the final, damning message from a victim, and the other containing a complete, encrypted history of manipulation and blackmail, was not a victim of circumstance. She was a calculated survivor who had been pushed past her breaking point. Reyes ordered an immediate, high-priority forensic deep dive into both of Priya's devices. The key was in the data. While the first phone held the visible trigger, Graham's careless final text to Priya, the second phone, the one hidden in the dagger sheath, held the entire, unedited narrative. It contained months of encrypted correspondence, Graham's veiled threats regarding the visa, his explicit demands, and Priya's desperate, coded attempts to refuse him, all proving that the affair was driven by coercion and power dynamics, not desire. The discovery of the evidence phone fundamentally shifted the investigation from a straightforward double homicide to a complex case of possible self-defense, forced prostitution, and honor-based manipulation that stretched across international lines. Reyes realized the prosecution would face a nightmare: a dead husband and father, digital proof of the father's blackmail, and a traumatized bride who, while stained with blood, held the digital keys to her own defense. The powerful Caldwell family, who had rushed to publicly condemn Priya as a gold digger and murderer, was about to be exposed for the rot and corruption that lay at their very foundation. The crime scene told the story of a tragic wedding night, but the phone data was about to tell the world the truth about the life that led to it. The digital evidence recovered from the ceremonial Kirpan sheath became the silent, undeniable witness the Caldwells never anticipated. Detective Inspector Sophia Reyes's team successfully decrypted Priya's insurance policy phone. What they found was not just proof of the affair, but an exhaustive timeline of Graham Caldwell's calculated, high-level coercion. The evidence included voice memos where Graham explicitly linked the continuation of Priya's residency visa to her compliance, text messages outlining his power within the government agencies, and even bank statements showing illicit transfers to accounts tied to Priya's extended family, payments meant to ensure her father's silence and cooperation. The narrative of the gold-digging Black Widow collapsed entirely, replaced by the far more devastating scandal of a powerful patriarch using his influence and wealth for sexual exploitation and blackmail. The arrest of Priya Singh, initially viewed by the public as an open-and-shut case of murder, was quickly overshadowed by the indictment of the late Graham Caldwell's estate for systemic corruption and coercion. The trial that followed did not take place in a courtroom. It took place in the media, spanning 2 continents and igniting explosive debates about immigration, power, and honor-based violence. The Caldwell family fought back with their vast resources, attempting to paint the encrypted phone data as fabricated evidence by a desperate, manipulative immigrant. They claimed Priya had seduced Graham to leverage her position, only killing both men when her scheme failed. The prosecution, however, made a strategic move. They used the cultural context of the Kirpan, the ceremonial dagger, as the final piece of the puzzle. They argued that the weapon, meant for defense and gifted by her culture, was a tragic symbol of Priya's final, desperate act of self-preservation. Priya herself took the stand, her silence replaced by a devastating, calm testimony. She described the chilling calculus of her situation, choosing between deportation and lifelong shame, or surrendering her body to the man who controlled her future. She recounted the final moments in the bridal suite, the terrifying realization that Ethan, her husband, had prioritized his father's honor over her safety, and that Graham intended to not only ruin her, but send her back to a life of certain disgrace. "I did not kill them for revenge," she stated, her voice steady. "I killed them because they had taken everything else, and they were coming for my survival." The turning point came when the prosecution presented a digital map, a geographic overlay of Graham's communication activity. It showed that immediately before the wedding, Graham had secretly met with an official from the Department of Home Affairs. This meeting coincided precisely with a final, unencrypted threat he sent Priya. The evidence proved he wasn't just threatening her visa. He was actively preparing her deportation as leverage for his control. This final, cold-blooded act of calculated power, even after the wedding, broke the defense's narrative of a crime of passion and firmly established Graham Caldwell as the aggressor. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours. The verdict was not guilty on all counts of murder. The jury found that Priya Singh acted in a state of self-defense, forced by circumstances and the immediate threat of violence and absolute ruin from two men who represented an insurmountable power structure. Priya Singh walked out of the Sydney courthouse not as a triumphant hero, but as a traumatized survivor. Her parents, who initially condemned her for the scandal, ultimately flew to Sydney to stand by her, their traditional shame replaced by the painful understanding of the horrific choices their daughter was forced to make. The Caldwell property empire was shaken to its core by the resulting investigations into fraud and coercion, forever tainted by the scandal exposed on that bloody wedding night. The luxury bridal suite, once the scene of a perfect Sydney wedding, was permanently decommissioned. Priya disappeared from the public eye, having won her freedom but losing her chance at a normal life. She was granted permanent residency in Australia on humanitarian grounds, the single thing she had fought so desperately for. The Kirpan, the ceremonial dagger that became the ultimate instrument of fate, was placed into police evidence and became the permanent, silent symbol of the night the Sydney bride chose survival over surrender. The Caldwell dynasty was broken, not by business failure, but by the deadly, unexpected consequences of arrogance and control.